they wouldn't bow to Roman authority, in the ecclesiastical system, had full authority to persecute and illegally murder their religious opponents, anybody that opposed their authority. Sparing you the long history of all these things, which is not a history lesson, the long and bloody history of religious tyranny that brought us the horror of the Crusades and the Inquisitions and the torture and the murder and the wars all throughout history to the present day, suffice to say that the church, as we know it, as it exists in our current society, has nothing to do with Christ in his ekklesia, his called out ones. Certainly much of the bitter persecution has ceased in our relatively free society, in our world today. We're permitted to practice the religion of our choice. But it doesn't negate the fact that the existing religious establishment in our time is not guilty of the same exact things. The establishment of professing Christianity today is still pagan to the core and practices all the pagan beliefs and doctrines that were blended in beginning in the 4th century. See, the churches as they exist in our towns and villages and cities on the corners where you live, in which the so-called Christians claim to worship the one and true God, are simply an offshoot of what happened in ancient Rome, where the pure doctrine of Jesus Christ was nullified by the teachings of men, beginning with people like Augustine and Ambrose and others. This is why the church has absolutely nothing to do. It has no similarity to the ekklesia of the Bible. That's why it's so confusing here. Why is that? Because it doesn't have any desire whatsoever to resemble that, only to play the game and be the form of religion. They have their system in place. It serves their purpose of gathering humanity under a unified pattern of religion, and where anything goes and the people are happy with their form of religion that suits them the best. Choose whatever denomination you want. See, establishment can then retain a fabricated authority over the attendees, insisting that they must submit to church authority and leadership if they want to remain in fellowship, lest they abandon the faith. I don't know how many times people told me when I left their establishment because of their false teachings and the sin, they say, well, you'll fall away if you don't have fellowship in the church. See, that you look at that Hebrews 10:25, not neglecting the assembling together. But see, that was the ecclesia assembly. Not assembling together under the guise of something that wants to hold you in bondage and ignorance. See, but this enforces the fantasy in the minds of the churchgoers that those who flee the system, like those of us that have come out, are just angry renegades and devils better off gone than stirring up trouble in their midst. See, in the olden times, in history, you look back and you see that the church, established church, exercised dominion over the people by the pretense of piety with their superstitions and their doctrines in the place of worship. So they say that, well, their building was consecrated to the Lord. You dare not blaspheme it or defile it in any way. So they would hunt down people that would be dissidents and burn anybody at the stake or torture them or brutally beat them if they tried to challenge any of the false doctrines and expose the sin. So if you think any of that's changed, well, maybe the brutalness has changed, but try going in among fellowship to one of these church establishment churches and challenge their false doctrines and begin exposing the sin, and you're going to find out very quickly that non-compliance will not be tolerated. You're going to find that out very quickly. See, a denominational church will use its entire governing body to see that you're silenced and cast out of doors. Independent organizations will muster the governing body of their church and see you're brought to shame in the eyes of the people. How different is that from excommunication or being branded a heretic by the religious establishment? It's not much different if you look at it. See, the illegitimate church system still holds a great sway over the gullible professing Christian public who fear being numbered among the rebellious. That's one of the biggest fears of them coming out of this system. See, God's greatest prophet, including John the Baptist, always stood aloof of the religious systems, as I've pointed out many, many times before. And they were always greatly outnumbered by the dominant forces of established religion. Elijah, for example, in the scriptures we see in 1 Kings 19:12-21, he stood against 450 false prophets of Baal that had already gone out and slain hundreds of the faithful of Israel. He stood alone against them. And so we must always, in many cases, stand alone against this onslaught of false teaching in sin that's coming against us. See, it's really of no surprise to the people that preach the true doctrine of the Lord are not permitted to buy and sell in the church, like Revelation 13 talks about. See, everybody's confused about that. They associate it with some kind of a mark or economic thing or a numbering system. But no, buy and sell in Revelation are metaphorical. To buy means the ability to participate in a marketplace. And to sell translates in the ability to barter in that place. Now, are God's true messengers able to go within the established church and preach repentance and faith proven by deeds? And demand people turn from their sin? Are they permitted to participate in these places of worship and barter, which I said is practicing or carrying out a trade among the church people? By no means. By no means whatsoever. Because why? Because they've not taken the mark. What is that mark? The mark is that lustful eye of the flesh. The lust of the eyes, lust of the flesh, the pride of life. They've cast that away from them in the crucifixions of the passions and desires of the flesh in repentance. That's not happening inside the establishment church. But with the ekklesia, the called out ones, it is happening. See, what has happened is the ekklesia is separated from the church from the very beginning. We see that in the persecuted groups throughout history. When Saul, in the book of Acts, for example, when he was wreaking havoc upon the church, he was entering into every house and dragging the men and women that were practicing this new Christianity off to prison, Acts chapter 8. Obviously, then, he was finding this ekklesia in the houses. He did not have to go to seek them out in the synagogues or the temples of Rome or any kind of approved place of worship. Well, the same holds true today. You're not going to find the called out ones of Christ participating at the table of demons in a place of idolatry. See, there's many scriptures that talk about house churches. There's 5 of them, in fact, in Romans and 1 Corinthians, Colossians, Philippians, and Acts that talk about the practice of the ekklesia in the homes of the individuals at the time. They didn't have places designated because it was not permitted. See, if we look back over the centuries of religious bondage to the days of ancient Rome, we find that a ruling elite has arrogantly ruled over the minds of men with superstition and fear of a vengeful God to bring them into submission. In darker times, even the mere suggestion that you were involved in anything that the church deemed blasphemy meant that you could be banished from common society, and oftentimes you suffer death by some horrible means. And the average person could not simply ignore this ecclesiastical influence of the day because the establishment had the power to brandish the full power of the state against anybody who opposed them. So unless you, as a little villager farmer out here, were willing to contest a standing army that thoroughly enjoyed butchering people, then you kowtowed to the system in spite of your convictions, because you'd starve to death if you ran off by yourself. Of course, things haven't changed much. They changed a little bit since the advent of liberty in the world, but billions still live under the authoritarian-style leadership of this establishment church. The major difference today with the Christian church, so-called Christian church, is they're no longer a threat to the darkened authorities. Therefore, as an organization, it's willing to exist within the parameters of state control, then it enjoys full acceptance of that state, even in places like China, as long as they're willing to not challenge the authority of the state. However, private gatherings in houses are still considered a danger by most regimes throughout the world, and they're looked upon kind of down your nose, even here in America, because they operate apart from the supervision of prying eyes. So many of the brain-dead, mind-controlled people still believe that their government supports their Bill of Rights, and the general public, among whom most professing Christians reside, they're already good minions of the state and subordinate. They subordinate themselves already to some authorized religion. So the religious systems of history have always provided man with a sanctuary for that sickness of mind called the church. So they've gone to extreme lengths to preserve that safe harbor for the carnality, including the use of torture and coercion in deceptions, in the use of superstitions and all the rest of it, sacraments and all that. Even when the vast majority of the Catholic system was challenged during what we call the Reformation, the duplicity continued. When the Bible was finally translated, now listen to this, when the Bible was finally translated into English by King James VI in the 1604 version, and come out in 1611, the esteemed translators that gathered together there in England were instructed to rigorously maintain the episcopal structure of the Church of England in its belief in an ordained clergy that ruled over the people. So they ordered the word ekklesia in the Greek to be translated church. And that's the way it appears in your English Bibles today. The Geneva Bible, the Bishop's Bible, all of them, right up to today, the English Bibles. So thus, it's been so. The church is still considered a sacred gathering place for the Christians, and the clergy keeps the people in a state of ignorance and bliss and control over them. However, this was never intended. The ekklesia